It's a great pleasure to welcome today's guest, Susan Greenfield. As you'll know very well, Baroness Greenfield is a prominent scientist, writer, broadcaster, and a member of the House of Lords. She specializes in the physiology of the brain and researches the impact of 21st century technologies on the mind, how the brain generates consciousness, and novel approaches to neurodegenerative diseases such as Alzheimer's and Parkinson's. So she's not idle, I think it's fair to say. Susan appears regularly on radio and television and has written a wide range of books on issues relating to the mind and the brain for the general reader. She joins us today to introduce her latest work called Mind Change. In the book and in her talk for us this afternoon, she'll explore the implications of the vast range of technologies which now shape and influence the daily rhythms of our lives, the way we work, learn, make and sustain relationships. How can we ensure that these powerful forces bring out the best in us and allow us to lead more meaningful, creative lives? The format is that Susan will speak for about 20 to 25 minutes. I'll ask her about 3 or 4 questions, and then we'll open up to the audience as a whole. And we'll end about 5 to 2 today to give Susan time to meet people individually at the end. Now, the main thing I wanted to say today is that the event is, we're very, very glad that Susan's here to join us, and very happy to speak about her book. But we also want to keep focused on the ideas, keep focused on the big picture of what this book's arguing, and less about Susan as public personality. And we're looking forward to getting into the meat and bones of this.
Coming up behind me as I speak?
No, it won't be. It won't be.
Something.
Which is a relief. But it won't be. But to keep that in mind when we answer the questions. But without any further ado, it's a great pleasure to welcome Susan Greenfield.
Good afternoon, everyone. Jonathan, thank you so much for that kind introduction. It's a great relief that that's not going to move now. That's just staying up. That's great. Yeah. Slightly distracting. I would hope, actually, that you wouldn't tweet as I speak, because I remember once being at some very fancy breakfast with Nick Clegg, and the lady next to me was so busy tweeting. She was having breakfast with Nick Clegg. She actually didn't listen to what he was saying. So although you might feel a great urge to do that, I would hope that in between the inputs of my mouth opening and shutting and your fingers going, there is a sort of period when there is some time for reflection. What I'd like to do in terms of preamble for introducing mind change, I'm sure you've come with lots of thoughts and preconceptions, is actually to start with the neuroscience, because I think it really is important in order to position the prism through which I have seen these issues, but also because I think it's important to grasp just how special your brain is and your mind is in order to realize the impact that the environment, any environment, is going to have on it. I'm assuming that most people here are not neurologists, is that right? Yeah, because no, I'm going to do this one day and there's going to be an audience of neuroscientists and neurologists in Mufti. You know? So if a neuroscientist is here or two, please forgive me if I tell you what you know very well, but I think it's important. So let's start off with what we mean by a mind. After all, it's half of the title of the book. What do we mean by a mind? How is it different from a brain? How is it different from consciousness? Well, let's take, of those 3 terms, the one that we're not going to talk about at all today, which is consciousness. I'll very happily, through the website, answer issues on that if you wish, or refer you to books I've written, but the main goal here is not to talk about this miracle of turning water into wine that we're doing every moment we're awake, but rather to think about something that I think can be distinguished from consciousness, and that's the mind. After all, you wouldn't have 2 terms otherwise. And when you go to bed tonight and lose your consciousness, you're not going to blow your mind, are you, or lose your mind? And similarly, you can blow and lose your mind, but at the same time, when you do so, you're still conscious. So what I would like to do is, first of all, clarify that we're going to talk about something that endures, something that's not fleeting, something you're not going to lose tonight or when the anaesthetist comes at you, something that is all about you, something that no one else has had for the 100,000 years we've stalked this planet, nor will they ever again. And even if you're a clone, an identical twin, you have a unique mind. It is your personality, if you like. In fact, it's the basis of that. Even on a desert island, when your personality wouldn't be apparent one way or the other, your mind is, it's how you see the world as opposed to how the world sees you. So from a neuroscientist angle, Jonathan's fessed up he's a philosopher, and I'd love to have his take on what philosophers think of the neuroscience view of the mind. But there are many philosophers, I'm sure he's not one of them, that like to draw distinctions between the mind and the brain. The first point I want to make is that I think they are inextricably linked. So let's just unpack that. What makes you different from a goldfish? Let's be brutal, the goldfish doesn't have a great personality, does it? It doesn't have a great character. And I've said many times, if your kids had a goldfish and it died, you could go while they were at school and buy another goldfish, and they'd come home and wouldn't know any difference. Whereas you couldn't do that with cats or dogs, and you certainly couldn't do it, even though they might wish you to, with their brothers or sisters. And that's because as we evolve, as we become more sophisticated, it's not to say that genes aren't important, of course they are, but they're much more important for the goldfish because that's why they have a limited repertoire. They have the tyranny of a very fixed stereotype repertoire of behavior, unlike us, who, of course, have much greater latitude for all the opportunities and behaviors that we have. So it's this that differentiates us, this ability to interact with the environment and have individual experiences. And guess what? If you have individual experiences, you're going to become, unlike the goldfish, an individual. And this is why we occupy more ecological niches than any other species on the planet. We don't run particularly fast, we don't see particularly well, we're not particularly strong compared to many animals, but gosh, what we are superlative at is learning, at adapting. So my first message to you is your experiences are going to determine very much your view of the world, if you like, your mind. How does this happen? Well, when you're born pretty much with all the brain cells that you need at the time, but it is the growth of the connections between the brain cells that accounts for the growth of the brain after birth. And it's astonishing, even in the first 2 years of life, you can see this changing of connections. And now, why that's exciting is these connections will be unique to you, even compared to your twin. They will have a unique configuration that's endlessly changing as you have your unique experiences. And this is something called plasticity. It doesn't mean to say the brain is plastic, of course. It comes from the original meaning of the word plastikos, to be molded. Let me give you two very brief examples of the astonishing plasticity of your brain, which accounts for why you are so individual. One is very famous, of London taxi drivers. You may have heard of this. Certainly the London taxi drivers have heard of this study, if you talk to them. And it involves the fact that, as you know, they have to learn all the streets of London, and they have to be able to recite to an examiner in an oral exam without recourse to a manual, all the one-way streets of London, how you'd get from A to B, respecting all those prohibitions. Now, to do that, they have a huge burden on what's called their working memory. And interestingly enough, in brain scans, one of the areas in the brain related to memory, it's an area called the hippocampus, is astonishingly in scans larger in London taxi drivers than in people of the same age. And it's not that having a big hippocampus predisposes you to being a London taxi driver, because, well, you have to think of these things, because the difference is more marked for the longer they've been driving. Now, perhaps not many people here are planning any day soon to become London taxi drivers, but perhaps many of you play the piano or have kids that play the piano. And this is an even more exciting experiment that I would like to challenge a philosopher with. It involves 3 groups of adult human volunteers. None at the beginning of the experiment had experience of playing the piano. And the first group, if you get a chance to volunteer for an experiment like this, try and not be in the control group, because they just stared at a piano for 5 days. So, as always, the poor old controls miss out. So anyway, so they were staring at the piano. Then there was a second group who learnt 5-finger piano exercises. And even in 5 days, forget about 2 years of training to be a cabbie, even within 5 days, you could see an astonishing change in the brain territory relating to the digits as the people were learning this specific activity as they were rehearsing it. But the most exciting group that I would love to talk to philosophers about is the third group merely were asked to imagine they were playing the piano. And their brain scans were pretty much the same as those that had physically learnt these new exercises. So I think there's lots of things that we can talk about on that, not that we have time. I'm just going to summarize. The first is you can't really distinguish between mental and physical, as though feelings and thoughts were in some kind of ether out there, and people like me deal with the squalor of the chemistry of the brain, and the two are completely unrelated. Obviously, that's not the case. The other important thing was that as far as the brain was concerned, the exciting and interesting part was not so much the contraction of the muscle, it was the thought that had preceded it. And this leads into a wonderful quote from the man who developed the treatment for Parkinson's disease in the last century, a man called Horner-Kowitz. He said this, he said, "Thinking is movement confined to the brain." Just digest that for a moment. It does beg the question, and this is totally relevant to what we're going to discuss later with the impacts of technology. What is a thought anyway? If we're saying things change your thinking, what do we mean by a thought? How is it different from a feeling? Well, just consider the tail-wagging dog or the purring cat or the gurgling baby or yourselves if you're having a good night out, or you shriek or you cry or you laugh, having an emotion, expressing an emotion. How does that differ from a thought? Well, I'd like to suggest to you that irrespective of the nature of that thought, be it a business plan, a logical argument, a fantasy, a lie, a memory, a hope, anything, they all have one thing in common. They all have one thing in common. You end up in a different place than where you started. That is to say, it has a beginning, a middle, and an end. A equals B, B equals C, therefore A equals C. And although it's not necessarily as cut and dried as that when you're having a thought, it nonetheless takes you to a different place. How do you get there? By a sequence of steps. Thinking is movement, sequence of steps confined to the brain. And I think this linearity is a really important issue to consider when we are thinking about, well, for want of a better word, we're thinking about thinking. Okay, so here we have the brain, this astonishing brain that is so exquisitely sensitive to the environment. What happens then when we're born? And I think, again, as by way of preamble, we need to think about how that makes you the person you are, how you see the world. So imagine when you're born, in the words of the great psychologist William James, into a booming, buzzing confusion. Lovely phrase. And you'll evaluate the world, you have no choice, in purely sensory terms. How sweet, how fast, how cold, how bright. So imagine when you're a little baby being confronted with something like a wedding ring. You might be attracted to it. After all, it's gold, it's shiny, you might want to roll it, you might want to stick your fingers through it, and physically, it might be something that attracts your attention, at least for a while. But gradually, as the weeks turn to months, turn to years, and as you may interact with other things like that you put on fingers, you'll learn that things like this go on fingers. And something gold and shiny, you can constrain it further, is different from all the other things that go on fingers, in that it will only go on one finger. And it will only go on one finger under certain circumstances. So that if you see someone with one of these gold things on their finger, it will mean something that other things on fingers do not mean. And then when you're grown, you might have one of your own. And it may be that this otherwise gold-looking generic thing is nonetheless the most important thing to you in your life because of all the associations that it triggers of your courtship, your partner, and so on. It might be the most precious thing to you. And or, as the years go on, let's say things go sour, it might be an object of the most bitterness as you go from the honeymoon to the divorce. You know, it might be something that evokes, again, very, very strong feelings that have changed. And all this complex feeling and emotion aroused by a simple gold shiny thing a baby would want to put in its mouth. What's changed? The object hasn't changed. It's up here what's changed. It's the connections. So your connections are personalizing your brain. Imagine when you're born, you'll see a series of abstract blobs and colors, and gradually you'll realize it's a face, and then it's the face of your mum. And then if mum features again and again and again in your life, and more associations are triggered with her, she'll mean something that other ladies do not. So I'd like to suggest to you the more connections you spawn around an object or a person, the more meaningful it is. Connections also have another valuable role. If I'd come on now this afternoon, having had a bad hair day, dressed as a ghost, say, let's just say, you know, draped in a white sheet, I doubt if anyone here would be very frightened, whereas a small child would be frightened, and incidentally also a dementing patient would be frightened. Now, why is this? Well, dementia is the mirror image, if you like, of development. Just as you grow lots of branches so you can make more connections in the young brain, those connections are dismantled, sadly, if you're a victim of this disease. It is a disease. It's a disease of older people, but it's not a consequence of aging. And if that happens, then you lack the checks and balances. You no longer have the personalized meaning you had as a child. So now you're back, again, sadly, to the booming, buzzing confusion. Now, we know the more that you interact normally with the environment, the more the brain is stimulated. And according to the particular neurons that are relevant, they will grow more branches. You're all familiar with use it or lose it, where in sports, the more you exercise muscle groups, the more they prosper. And if, as my brother, he broke his ankle recently, and he was astonished at how quickly his calf muscle atrophied as a result of not being used. Brain cells are operating on a similar use it or lose it principle, but what happens with them is that they grow branches. Now, why is that interesting or important? Well, by growing more branches, you are able to make more connections because you are increasing the surface area. And by making more connections, you can therefore have a meaning to things that you didn't before. One final point I'd like to make about this general, this is probably one of the most speedy introductions to neuroscience you've ever had, is when I mentioned about blowing the mind and losing the mind. So I'd like to just say the mind is the personalization of the brain through the dynamic configurations of connections triggered in turn by your unique experiences. And it starts off as a one-way street, how sweet, how fast, how cold, how bright, but slowly as those connections form, it turns into a two-way dialogue. Every experience you are having will upgrade and update your connections, and every experience you're having will be judged and evaluated through the existing connections. So you're in this lovely dialogue with the outside world. And this gives you a narrative. It gives you a life story. Again, this linearity of a beginning, a middle, and hopefully in the dim future, the final end. Yeah? And everyone has their unique trajectory. And it's this that gives you the identity, I think, that we all so treasure, that makes you so special. And it's all due to the connections in your brain. Now, what about then when you blow your mind or lose your mind? What about when you have a sensational time? There are ways that ever since humanity stalked the planet, we have devised ways in which we can, if you like, not access or impair that connections, so you are back to being in the sensational world. If I said now, let's go out and have a cognitive time, who's going to come? Anyone? Well, you're having cognitive time now, I hope. Yeah? So what do we mean by having a sensational time? Well, traditionally, wine, women, and song, drugs and sex and rock and roll, they all have a feature in common. They abnegate the sense of self. That is to say, either one's taking psychoactive agents that will impair the chemical transmission, or you're putting yourself in a scenario stripped of all cognitive content. Techno. Sorry, perhaps it's wildly out of date, but you probably know what I mean, where you have the beat, where the premium is on the flash of the lights or the beat of the music, and you've just let yourself go. You've let yourself go, you've blown your mind. Or whitewater rafting, you choose it, whatever way you want to do it. It's either very fast-paced or very strongly sensory, or one's taken agents. And the very word ecstasy in Greek, ecstasis, is to stand outside of yourself. We were discussing classics earlier. And this has been going ever since the time of Euripides, who wrote a play called The Bacchae, all about the wine force and the bread force, the need to have this balance. Now, what we know now, Euripides didn't know it, is a central player in this is an area of the brain called the prefrontal cortex. And this is only mature in late teenage years, early 20s. And it is characterized, when it's underactive, the brain is characterized by recklessness, by high emotion, by living in the moment. You may recognize this profile in teenage children because it's not fully mature. Now they've got an excuse. They can say, if any young people are here, their prefrontal cortex hasn't fully kicked in yet. Yeah? Now, we also know that a chemical messenger called dopamine, a powerful chemical messenger that's released and does many things in the brain. Among other things, it's related to drugs of addiction, to arousal, and to reward processes. This will inhibit that frontal part of the brain. So you can see that if you are engaged in recreational drugs or pleasure, that what probably you're looking at is a surge in dopamine, which will disable this prefrontal cortex so that you are now living in the moment, having raw emotions, no longer the past, the present, or the future. All that said, now let's consider the digital technologies. How long have I got?
About 5 minutes.
5 more. Okay, we've got 5 minutes to do the whole of the digital technology, and that's fine. But I'm sure you'll ask lots of questions. But I wanted to set the scene because if you have specific questions, I knew from the outset I wouldn't be able to go through the hundreds of references piece by piece, and we don't have slides. So I thought I'd set the scene and leave you to then raise the specific questions relating to the digital technologies. I just want to put the case that they are different and they are posing a new environment for us. And if the environment's changing, then I don't think anyone will contest the logic that we might be looking at unprecedented changes. I draw comparisons with climate change in 4 ways. One is it's controversial. I'm sure everyone here is aware it's controversial, just like climate change. Second, it's unprecedented. We can argue the toss on that. Some people like citing the printing press and the car and so on, and the TV. We can discuss why I would take exception to that. It's global. Of course, that's perhaps the most obvious of all. And the most important parallel, I think, is that it's multifaceted. I think we're doing no one a service to simplistically say our computer's good or bad. It's like saying is a car good or bad. And even within the questions, as always in life, there are complex pros and cons. As someone said, for every complex situation, there's always a simple answer, and it's always wrong. So I think what we need to do is not expect me, certainly not me, to bring tablets down from the mountain with a simple answer, yes, no, right or wrong, despite the fact that many would love me to do that, I'm sure, well, for different reasons. But at the same time, I think collectives, a society, we need to explore how we're going to make the most of this technology, because a child born now has a 1 in 3 chance of living to be 100. So what are they going to do for the second 50 years of their life? Are they just going to play Grand Theft Auto? What are they going to? Let's hope a lot of us are going to live for, into our second 50 years. What are we going to do? How are we going to express ourselves as individuals? Now, this is a luxury that very few generations and very few cultures have had before. Sadly, now around the world, we could all cite many examples of people who are hungry, who are in pain, who are frightened, who are sick. And in the past, previous generations didn't have the luxury of saying, who am I? How can I stretch myself? What can I get out of life that will fulfill me as an individual? But now, for the first time, collectively, we can ask these questions. So because I was aware of the impact of the brain and the environment, and because as a 21st century citizen, I was truly interested in what the middle of the 21st century is going to look like when I'm in old age. What kind of society do we want? And as a now sadly departed colleague, James Martin, said, we shouldn't ask what's going to happen in the future. We should ask, how can we shape the future? That's a much better question. And what I'd like to do is, in writing this book, where there are hundreds of peer-reviewed papers that you might not want to look at directly, you're welcome to, I thought I'd give an overview and review that so that we could stimulate debate, so that we could try and collectively work out the world that we want to live in, rather than just sleepwalking into it. Thank you very much. Again.
Great, thank you very much, Susan. I want to pick up with your comparison with climate change at the beginning,
indeed.
Before coming into anything else, because you mentioned that the comparisons are that it's controversial, it's unprecedented, it's global, and it's multifaceted. But the one difference that I think gets to the heart of maybe the debate about this book is that climate change is almost always seen as pretty much a bad thing universally. There are 1 or 2 people who say it might have some positive effects here and there, but by and large it's either bad or devastating. So the concern with using that analogy, people will say, on the one hand you're saying, look, technology is changing us, our brains respond to environments, this is our new environment, therefore let's talk about this at the most generic. But on the other hand, you do seem to be raising alarm bells too. So can you give us a sense in where you are on that?
Okay. With the very notion of an alarm bell, and you're being kind, you're not saying scaremongering, which is what some people like to say. You're welcome. But I'm saying, as I mentioned in the book, it's hard to know whether one's scaremongering or sounding a wake-up call until you've actually looked and discussed it. And whilst if people want to draw the conclusion, having looked through all the data and the evidence that it's scaremongering, that's fine, they're welcome to that. But let it be the conclusion, not the opening premise. And I think that that's really important. But you're right in flagging the fact that, like all analogies, they're imperfect. And I think a much more important comparison with climate change, where they are not the same, is that with climate change, as far as I understand it, it is kind of damage limitation. There's nothing further. We can slow things down. I'm not a climate change expert, so forgive me if anyone is. But as far as I know, there's certain things that can't be changed, and we're having to try and make the best of it. With mind change, the whole point is it doesn't have to be like that, and I don't see it as something that is necessarily all negative. But this time, the difference with climate change is we can do something. We can harness this technology. I don't want to suddenly put hatchets through all computers, contrary to what some may hope that I'm saying. I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is, given this is such a pervasive and such a powerful technology, and given it is creating, if you like, a parallel life, a parallel lifestyle for some, can't we make it a means to an end rather than an end in itself? Can't we then articulate some end that we would like? And this end could be the best ever for humanity. It could be the most exciting time of our lives in a way that climate change never can be.
So I think it's very clear from that answer and also from your book that this is not a sort of completely technophobic agenda. You're not going out there saying all these things are bad, never tweet again, never go on Facebook. But on the other hand, there is a concern that when we're thinking about what exactly you are saying, you're not just saying, let's talk about this. It feels like, or would you say that's all you're saying? Or are you actually saying, look, there are real and present dangers to, for example, attention span,
I'm doing what people hate in scientists. I'm using the subjunctive rather than the indicative a lot. I'm saying it could be the case that maybe. Yeah?
Right, okay.
Now, this really irritates people. Yeah? They want clear, cut and dry thing. They want the indicative. And I'm sorry, but in science, everything is always provisional. Yeah. One's always tentative, and proudly so, because you are keeping an open mind. You're curious. You're exploring things. And what I hoped I was doing here was neither of those things. I hoped I was going on a journey and taking the reader on a journey with me, where one was asking questions and trying, given the limited information we had, given the imperfect world in which we live, trying to see a way forward and trying to reach some kind of interim summaries and overviews. That's not to say, much as though it's popular and everyone loves, is this good or bad? I flatly refuse to do that, I'm sorry. And you're going to be stuck with the subjunctive, because it is accurate.
Okay, even if we're stuck with the subjunctive, let's make it more specific. So you've spoken about the generic, the sort of general impact on us and our brains and our minds. But if we can speak about something particular, it's your choice, either empathy, facial recognition, or attention span.
Oh, I've got a choice, have I?
Yeah, any of those three.
Oh, I could do it. Okay.
What are the potential impacts on one of those things?
Okay, let's talk about attention span. That's one of the most straightforward. What do you want to ask me a question about it?
Should we worry about our attention spans? Are we going to lose the ability to read books?
Okay, let me ask audience participation. Hands up who's worried about their attention span.
Okay, for those watching at home, that's about between a third and a half, I think.
Hands up who's not at all worried. They think attention span is great.
Not at all worried. Similar number, a few abstentions, I think.
Hands up who's worried about their children's attention span.
That's similar. The room's hedging it quite carefully.
Sorry, it was mean of me to do that, but I just wanted to...
It's okay.
I'm a scientist, you see. I wanted to get some data.
Sure, of course. Get some data by all means.
I would cite also, and I think this is important to consider, as well as the science, to look at what's out there. And I, for one, like buying I. Sorry to advertise, I'm allowed to, rather than the Independent, the abbreviated one. The popularity of, I'm Ali Cressel with your 90-second news update. Yeah? Right. Now, the fact that the mainstream print and broadcast media are clearly packaging news in easy sound bites and in short things, that should surely tell you something, that people are needing or wanting or feel something that panders to a shorter attention span.
That's fine.
Yeah?
And should we be concerned about that? What's your view? Is that
you can say, I could ask you.
Well, I'm a little concerned about it, but I mean, I want to know, given someone who's researched it deeply, are you merely observing that phenomenon impartially and value neutrally? Or are you actually saying, because this is happening, we ought to be very careful now?
Yeah, no, what I'm saying is, since this is happening, we need to consider the implications. So I'm not just saying, oh, look, there's a shorter attention span. Oh, look at these papers showing that there's a link with video games and shorter attention span. I'm saying, since there appears to be this finding, what can we do about it? What are the implications in the longer term? What does it actually mean? And I think that's what we need to discuss.
Okay, and on the premise, since there is, the sort of scientific methodology mindset would say, how firm is the evidence for that contention?
Okay. Well, again, I'm assuming most people here aren't scientists, so perhaps if you forgive me, I'll just say a little bit about what we mean by evidence.
Of course, sure.
And I do explore that in one of the early chapters to try and clarify, because obviously it's a mantra of many to say there's no evidence or the evidence isn't good enough and so on. So let's just get this out of the way straight away. When you do a scientific paper, you do a very specific test of a falsifiable hypothesis. That's to say, it's a very specific question. It's not a general one, as the notion of mind change. It's a very specific question that you're asking. And then, given the limitations of your resources, you will have data, which you then interpret in a certain way, always provisionally. In every discussion of any paper, it's always more work needs to be done, or given the limited sample size, or given the... and then along come everyone attacking, which is what scientists do to each other. And that is a healthy thing to do, as long as they don't get personal. Scientists love, reviewing and referring, and that's how you zigzag forward. So no two scientists, say you and I were looking at some data now, it's possible we would disagree. It's possible I would see something important that you wouldn't think that relevant, or vice versa. As always, more work needs to be done, because inevitably you're not sure, especially if it's a negative finding, you're not sure if the measurement time was right, if your instruments were refined enough, if you were looking at the right sample of subjects, and on and on. So there is very rarely that any paper is conclusive. It's very rare that any paper is seen as definitive. Everything is up for debate, and this is healthy, this is what we do. So in terms of evidence, when I say there's evidence, but it's not conclusive. No, I'd be very surprised if any scientist said this is conclusive evidence. It's not the sort of thing we say.
But one example to give us a taste of what evidence showing reduced attention span might look like, either that's already happened or a test that might show that.
Yes, well there's tests showing that it's specifically linked. There's some by someone called Swing, I think his name is. Actually, in anticipation of this, I did bring references along in my handbag. Right. Do you want me to get those out, or is that too clunky?
It's a little clunky.
No, I won't, no, but just know it's there.
If there's a pause while I'm getting lots of questions, you can grab it. Ruffle it later, yeah.
Or you could buy the book, huh?
Well,
and look up Swing. But anyway, and again, this is anticipating a question that someone might ask, he actually controlled for the effects of television.
Okay.
And then anticipated, they looked at the behaviour of the children and were able to predict. So this was quite, to my mind, quite persuasive. I'm not going to say it's the only paper that ever needs to be done. Sure. But nonetheless, I think one has to look at those things.
So I agree that there are evidence Daleks out there who don't really want to think about the broader picture, just want, where's the evidence, where's the evidence? On the other hand, people would want to be sure that when you present a big picture question like this and say this should be a new agenda, climate change takes up a certain amount of our public attention, mind change ought to as well. They want to know that there are premises there that are sufficiently rigorous and broad and deep, and also that there's a spirit of falsification, not a spirit of verification. So can you give us a taste for what it would mean for you to be wrong? What sort of thing would have to appear for you to think what I'm saying doesn't work?
No, it's an interesting question, but there is a problem there, in that you can't prove a negative in science. Right. I can't prove to you definitively there's not a teapot in orbit around Mars.
Right. No.
Yeah, I can't do that.
Granted.
So I can't. I'm just saying it's tough. Yeah. Probably it would have to be something positive, and I would cite these that there are certain benefits. For example, it could be the case that video games are linked to raised IQ levels.
Sure.
Let's take that.
For example, yeah.
Sure. And I know, and to be honest, I do try. And when I did this book, I was very careful, anticipating just such a criticism of cherry-picking, not saying positive things. I engaged the services of someone who'd done a PhD in video games to really double-check that we were across the literature. I really did that as much as we can. Anyway, so let's say we show something wonderful about the impacts. And I put my hand up and say, well, that's fine. You see, it's not a question of proving me right or wrong, because it's such a multifaceted and complex thing. In some things, there's a problem, but of course in other things there's benefits. And I'd like to think, within the limitations available, I tried to give as clear a case as I could for those things. Agree. Yeah.
So, I mean, the way I sort of visualize this book and this thesis is that in the center of it, you've got the brain and sort of neuroscience. You've got science and questions about scientific methodology, and you've got technology and particularly social media as a sort of central cluster of your argument. Then you go on to questions, ethical and social questions about what kind of people do we want to be?
Indeed.
What is the future we're trying to shape? Yeah. And do you have a sort of particular vision of that? I mean, you say we have to talk about it.
Yes, well, I personally do, but with all the
can we hear that? Because it might be useful to contextualize the kinds of answer that might arise from that inquiry.
Should I just say that in terms of what kind of society we want, I am no more authoritative or qualified than anyone else in this room. Sure. But I'm a citizen and I'll have a view. Right. And so with the absolute understanding, this is my personal view, nothing based on anything. This is me, what I would like. Yeah. I think if I had kids, and I don't, but if I had them, or for other people's kids, I think I'd like three things for them. I think I'd like them to have a strong sense of their own identity. And I think that's questionable at the moment if you look at the report out from the government last year on the volatile nature of identity as a result of social networking, for example. I think I'd like them to have a strong sense of their own identity. I think I'd like them, or I'd like to live in a society where people are fulfilled. Now, I know that sounds like, pangloss, but surely it is possible that we can think of ways in which people get a sense of gratification or fulfillment above and beyond owning the designer trainers or having 5,000 friends on Facebook. It'd be very nice if people could have things that gave them a sense of fulfillment. And the third thing I would like is that they're useful to society. Okay. Now, those three things, which are my personal shopping list, it might be you don't want those things. I do. Fulfillment, a strong sense of identity, and use to society. There's one thing that actually ticks all those boxes. Creativity. And I don't mean writing a symphony, but just seeing the world in a different way, joining up the dots in a way they've never been joined up before. So for me personally, that would be my agenda, to help people develop a sense of strong individuality and creativity.
Well, that's music to the RSA's ears, because creativity is a big part of what we do. But people would want to know, that's fine and sounds all very well, and I know it's your personal view and not a scientific view. But then they'd want to know, okay, so what's your impression of why this technological development, social media saturation, is impinging or undermining that in any way?
No, I think that's a fair question. And I would again like to give the caveat, of course, it's not every single person for whom this applies. The concern for me was when it shifts from being not a means to an end, but the end in and of itself.
Okay.
For people that perhaps wake up in the morning, go shopping, go dating, work, all without looking at another human being. Okay. Yeah, this is, my concern was when it takes over your life in a way that stops you walking on a beach, giving someone a hug, looking someone in the eye.
Okay,
yeah.
Of course.
Now, if you can do all those things, it's a bit like having a bit of chocolate, you know. Very few people would stop people having a tiny bit of chocolate. But I think we'd be concerned if someone was dieting obsessively on chocolate.
Okay.
Yeah. So it's a little, and like all analogies, don't pin me, I'm sure now all the detractors will start looking up chocolate manufacturers and suing me or something. But it's just a loose and gentle analogy, yeah, so it's not meant for, yeah. Okay. So my concern then about where we're going is that people may be missing out, however wonderful the screen activity is, if it's done excessively. By definition, given there's only limited time in the day, there'll be time not doing other things. But I think my main worry is in interpersonal communication. Even just now in Ofcom, there was a report from Ofcom after this book was published saying that young people were losing their voice, that it seems that face-to-face communication was suffering. There's a recent report out for employers saying that people seem to lack interpersonal skills. Now, I'm not... please, I'm not making a one-one causality.
No, I understand that, yeah.
But I'm saying if we are putting a premium, as certainly I would, on interpersonal skills and relationships and empathy and being able to look at someone, having a strong sense of identity, we should question how we can have a fulfilling environment where it's not just all about having your 500 friends and tweeting and getting instant feedback and defining yourself externally. I think, just very briefly, if we talk about identity, and I'm interested in this, for those of us who were born in the last century, and I suspect that's most people in this room, without getting too personal or insulting to people, when you're a kid, don't you remember that magic thing of saying to someone, let's make up a game. Let's make up a game. And, the toys, the dolls and the soldiers, they didn't ask you to play with them. And the tree didn't ask you to climb it, and the drawing pad didn't ask you to draw in it. And so you drove the narrative. It was internal. It was your imagination with these low-grade things. Now, I fear we are in a society where those things which I would argue gave you an inner narrative and a robust identity are much more fragile than they were. Okay,
they're more fragile. So, I have a 5-year-old who loves the iPad, but at the same time, he can still make up a game and play without it. So people will say, they want to know, you seem to be saying it's somehow imperial, and this is the last point for me. You're saying the technology is somehow imperial and sort of takes over. And you've also said
it can do. I don't say it does. I say it can do.
Can do.
It can do.
A couple of times you've spoken about the danger of something that's a means to an end, human flourishing, identity, and so forth, becoming the end in itself.
Yes.
So you're implying somehow that technology will become what we live for. Is that what you were worried about?
I'm worried about it, yes. It can be. And for some, it certainly already is.
And in a way that supplants these other human aims?
Well, yes, it does, I think. It can do. And again, just look at the goods and services that are out there, look at how people are spending their time. And so, again, I don't want to do a one-size-fits-all simplistic argument. I'm just saying that we should be aware of these trends so we can anticipate any issues and we can harness the benefits and maximize them to create, for your little boy? Your little boy, who's 5, what kind of world do you want him to live in? And it's in our hands to do something about it, as opposed to just saying, oh, well, too late. It's not.
All right, great, thank you very much. So we have questions from the audience, and err on the side of putting your hand up sooner rather than later. That clock's a little fast, so we have just slightly more time than that might suggest. Now, I will take, let's think. Well, I'll take the gentleman at the front first, please, if we can get them. Wait for the mic. Introduce yourself briefly, and keep the question reasonably short if you can.
Hi, Sean Glasgow. I'm a fellow here at the RSA. I thought the example of the ring was very good in terms of the history through the life, how that might change. This wiring that we go through around certain symbols and objects, that can be positive or it can be negative. And I tend to think of judgment versus perception, and you can get somebody who's very ethical, who's just stuck on something. If you could talk a little bit about that, that'd be great.
Yeah, when we think about the negatives, the example that comes to mind immediately is one of depression, where we know that cognitive therapy can be very effective in depression and much more effective in many cases than classic medication. Now, what's happening in cognitive therapy, the way I interpret it in terms of the connections of the brain, is that the therapist is helping rearrange those connections. It's as though there's a persistence and an overly strong connection that traps the person in a certain situation, in literally a certain mindset, so they cannot see alternatives, they can't enjoy other things because they are already in a, I won't say hardwired, it's a phrase I don't like, but they're in a stubborn connections. And what cognitive therapy or the person is able to do is to help you see the world in a different way. So it's not that the person you're grieving who might be dead, you forget them, of course not, but you help see the world differently. And that's an example of how perhaps the connectivity could be negative, an example of how it can be manipulated.
Okay, thanks very much. Yeah. There's a question here. We'll take one there, and then we'll take three as a cluster here in a moment. Just move the mic along. And if we can keep the questions to the content of the book, the general understanding of science and the brain is part of that, but as far as possible, try and keep on this relationship between brain and technology. Yes, please.
Hi.
That is Eleanor Sturdy, also a fellow here. My question, I apologise, I haven't read the book, so I don't know if
it's available now.
The interest I have is around workplace diversity, maternity leave, and so on. And I wondered if you could comment on what we know now about early attachment and the various forms of insecure attachment that might develop in someone who's not getting really good early years attention, and how that might then play out into policies for those kinds of things.
And
Just, I mean, by all means speak about early attachment. If you can, weave it into the more general question.
Okay. So
is it covered in the book? In which case,
yes, I mention attachment theory in the book. What I don't mention is maternity policy. Although I'm happy to talk about it in relation to women in science and get hold of me personally. Yeah.
Thank you. Okay, we have. We'll take over this side, please. We have about three together who've been waiting patiently. Lady at the front first, and then two behind you. If we could take them together before we answer them.
Okay,
thanks.
I'll try and remember all three.
That's okay, that's my job. I'll try and do that. Okay,
thank you very much for that. As someone associated with a Parkinson's sufferer, I take a great interest in your work and have done for some time. And Jonathan, you mentioned ethical. I thought that was interesting because on Saturday, Tim Berners-Lee said that he's concerned that both governments and corporations are in a potential position to abuse the internet. Now, I personally, and it's just one example, feel myself constrained a lot of the time into being a computer-complicit citizen or a computer-conditioned consumer.
Okay.
And I think that this could well link with the sorts of things you're saying, not saying definitively at all, but a danger and something to be aware of.
Great, thank you. And then just gentleman behind you.
George Mallon, fellow of the Society. Many years ago, I think it was Jerome Bruner talked about different forms of representation. You know, the inactive to deal with booming and buzzing, then the evolution to iconic, then to abstraction or symbolic representations. Does that kind of progress still stand up in the light of modern research? And if so, could we see the digital as a step forward in that progression?
Great, thank you. And then a gentleman...
These are great questions, thanks.
You know, there'll be more to come. I'm sure that
Give me time to answer them. Right?
I know you do, don't worry.
Thank you.
We've got
Ramesh, I'm just a visitor. You talked of creativity and also thinking. I want you to say something about how closely related creativity and thinking are. And if it is, what does neuroscience teach us to how we can promote thinking?
Thanks very much. Okay,
thank you.
So do you have them or do you want me to reiterate?
Well, I'll do the recency effect. Can I do creativity first? It's fresh in my mind. And I do address this again. Sorry to sound like a broken record, promoting the book, but I do go into those. I think creativity is not the mystical necessarily thing that sometimes people hold it to be, where you either have it or you don't have it, and there's the Mozarts of the world and there's the rest of us, ordinary human beings. I think to greater or lesser extents, we can be creative in what we do, not necessarily write Mozart-type music, but we can be creative. And I think there's a three-step process, and that does require nurturing. The first is to deconstruct or challenge dogma. So in science, you're creative when you say, hang on, but why are we assuming that's the case? Or you challenge, why have we put the engine in the front of the car? Why? Why don't we put it in the back? So that's the first thing. And again, in art, as far as I understand it, and I'm on slippery.
Sure.
I'll be quick.
I'm just keen to keep it to the book's content.
Okay, I'll be very quick. You deconstruct it into textures and colours and luminosity and so on. So the first is to deconstruct, to not take things for granted, to actually pull things apart. The second is to bring together unusual things. For example, you might point to a child's painting. And there's one I have of a sheep with purple body and little magenta legs and so on. And you say, well, why isn't that sheep a work of art then, like Damien Hirst's Pickled Sheep is? Whether or not you like that, I don't know. And I think the answer comes to the third thing that you need in creativity. It's not so much just to deconstruct and challenge dogma in either arts or science. It's not just to bring together unusual things, because we know in schizophrenia, for example, people have word salads. People on drugs think they're poets by bringing together a jumble of words. No, those new things have to mean something. And remember I said earlier that meaning or significance is the joining up of dots in a new way? So that people say, aha, now I see something different. Now I understand. I've never thought of it like that. That's the final third step. So
that's useful, but just to follow up with reference to the book, many people think that the internet, social media and so forth are the midwife of a creative flowering of humanity. They think that these are the tools that will help us become the most creative species ever.
And their evidence is?
Well, they would ask you the same question.
No, but I'm saying, why do they say that?
Well, I believe they say that because of what you mentioned about deconstructing. There's lots of evidence of other people doing things differently, so they're aware of that. They also have social connections, so they have more ideas and resources to rely on. And then your final stage about meaning, they have a bigger audience to reach. So there is a reason why even your structure would suggest that's the case.
Okay, well, let's see. I mean, most of the people who are so-called digital natives, as defined by people, you know, like born in the 1995 or so, they're still teenagers. So let's see what symphonies they write and what novels they write in the future. But I will say this, I think one of the enemies to creativity, there's two enemies that I can say. One is this obsession with being networked and communicating with each other all the time. Because if you are constantly, like the lady I cruelly cite at the Clegg breakfast, if you're constantly input-output, when do you have time to reflect and join up the dots in a new way? When do you have time, as you do when you read a book, to put it down and think, hang on, if that, then that, if that, then that. Now, it may be people want some kind of collective creativity. That may happen, as was anticipated 50 years ago by a Jesuit priest called Chardin, the so-called noosphere. That may be the case if they want that. But my own view is that creativity, and this actually has been cited in the paper, is often the result of going out into nature, of walking. There's actually, I think I cite it in the book, there's in Ann Arbor, they took them either in the city or in the country, and they found that when they did these creativity tests, the people that walked around in the country were more creative. Okay,
so not necessarily more or less creativity or better or worse, but certainly different.
Certainly different, but I say it depends how you're defining creativity, but I think in order to maximize the opportunity for it to happen, of course you can't just dial it up, I would suggest not being incessantly connected with others, and being in a natural environment where you're walking, that probably would favour or predispose the creative process more than playing Grand Theft Auto, yes.
All right. Yes. And then coming back to the initial question, was about this idea of being a complicit citizen, somehow that we're plugged in all the time, we give all our data and so forth, and that somehow this helps perpetuate this attachment to technology.
Yeah, well, certainly the World Economic Forum last year, in 2013, as one of their risks on their global risk register, cited just that, what they called being hyper-connected, or the digital wildfire, where there was this spread possibly of misinformation, but certainly of being so connected you didn't have time to think. And even, and I quote this in the book, even Eric Schmidt, who's the chairman of Google, chairman of Google says, I worry about the level of interrupt is affecting cognition, it's affecting deeper thinking. He says, I still believe sitting down and reading a book is the best way to learn something. I worry that we're losing that. I've learnt the quote off by heart, as you could tell.
Great, yeah, very nice. And then finally on developmental psychology, you know, there is this progression of human cognition and so forth.
Yes.
Where does technology fit into
what
that?
I fear with that, and so just to recap with everyone else, you start off with these abstract sensations and gradually they become identifiable in terms of patterns, whether they're rings or faces or whatever, and then they acquire a cognitive significance or a symbolism. So a bit of cloth with stripes and stars on it might mean a lot to us here, or Americans, to someone in, I don't know, Papua New Guinea, child, it would mean any. So gradually you have this idea of symbols. And then, of course, you start to think metaphorically. The example I give is of my much maligned brother when he was small, and I forced him to learn Macbeth. And he didn't understand out, brief candle life is but a poor player, because he was only 3, because he couldn't see the analogy. He couldn't see the analogy with death, So, in answer to your question, I think the problem of when you have an environment that by definition is highly visual and highly auditory, where the whole point is to present a supersensory, exciting, you are forcing people to stay at a stage of the icon, of the literature. For example, how would you explain honour to someone, I wonder, using a screen? How would you do that?
Interesting, thank you. Okay, what we're going to do is we have just under 5 minutes left. We're going to briskly take all of the questions remaining, but we're not going to attempt to answer
I'll
them.
answer all of them.
We're not. We're going to take all of them to get a sort of proxy for the zeitgeist.
Yeah.
And then we're going to take 2 minutes for you to answer as much as you can and sum up.
Yeah, can I just say one very quick thing?
Very quick.
No, I have a website where you are very welcome to ask specific questions on that.
Right.
So please feel free if you feel disenfranchised now.
Okay, we'll have to be very brisk with the mic as well. So if we can begin at the back and then move down swiftly. And please keep it quick because we'll run out of time otherwise.
Yes, Oliver Fellow here. So with the chunking brought by these internet technologies, would that give us more chance to create connections instead of one long narrative?
Okay, chunking. Yep, next.
Hello, Simon, I'm a fellow here. You hinted at this in what you were saying earlier. I think that there is a potential for people who have less fulfilling lives to get completely addicted to these things, whereas people who already have things in their lives can dip in and dip out. Mm-hmm. Can you connect that to how Google and Facebook monetize what they do,
Yeah. Wow.
and the effect on society?
Big question, yes. And then gentleman here, please. If you can reach. We've got a lockdown. We got it. Okay, thanks. Yes, go
Do
ahead.
the children taxi drivers have slightly bigger hippocampus?
Children taxi drivers. Okay, we'll keep that one on. Okay, and the others, but yeah, we're not going to get all of these. So I'm going to take Twitter. Do we have a question, Kenny, from Twitter? Okay, let's just take it because it's of the moment, I think. But we'll take a question.
It hasn't come up behind us.
No, it hasn't. Don't worry.
Twitter.
But let's hear it.
Yeah, quick question from Twitter. Michael asks, how hard is it to reprogram the brain that's stuck in bad thoughts?
How hard is it to reprogram the brain?
To reprogram a brain that is stuck in bad thoughts.
Stuck in bad thoughts. I'm sorry. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, okay.
Fine. I think executive decision. I'm not going to be able to get all the questions in, so it's time for Susan to, and then particularly the question about fulfilling and unfulfilling lives was particularly rich.
Yes, I think so.
But any other questions about how hard is it for the brain to reprogram?
Okay. So, and I think also the same gentleman touched on the commercial issues, and we haven't really got onto that, and it's something that we can't, it's like the elephant in the room. We have here a gazillion million-dollar industry.
Sure.
And whenever money's involved, then that has to colour what happens. And so that's all I want to say, that we can't put to one side that if you have a load of people having fun and other people making money out of them, then that is going to perhaps shape how they're controlled, what happens to them, and so on. Right. Yes, I think that's a really important point about the fulfilling life. Let's think about that, because it's kind of chicken and egg.
Sure.
Some might argue that if, as a young person who's much more easily influenced by their peers, they feel, and I work with people in their 20s, I know what this is like, they feel they have to be on Facebook a lot, they have to, for reasons that I still don't understand, take photos of the food they're eating and send it to others. I honestly don't understand this, but nonetheless, it's obviously what they do. Someone might say that's not a very fulfilling thing to do. Yeah. What I find very interesting is the rise and rise of the soul. This is going to answer the question. Yeah. If everything you do now is shared, let's say every cake you eat, every thought you have, it's a flood of consciousness out on Twitter. Every breath you take, indeed. Yeah. They're watching you. I'll be watching it. Exactly, yeah. So that's exactly. Now, if that's the case, whilst before we've always had a private life and a public life, most importantly, we've also had a secret life. We've always had an inner narrative that is just ours. Now, if that is also downloaded, what is left? Right. What are you?
Right.
What are you? The only thing, there's one thing left to you. What is it? It's your face.
Right.
And guess what? You bung it everywhere. It's the selfie. Okay. And I'm sure this obsession with your face going on to, not your face, I mean, faces going on to everything is some people perhaps who feel a very fragile sense of identity. They feel that everything else is shared and everything is porous. The one thing that can't be shared with another person is the thing that is makes you, unless you're an identical twin.
And just to show you're not hostile to Twitter, that last question about how difficult is it to rewire your brain in about 30 seconds, please.
Okay, we're rewiring our brains all the time. And it's whatever you rehearse or whatever you do. And there's a brilliant study that came out just 2 weeks ago of pre-teens. And in America, they took away all their digital devices just for 5 days and sent them to summer camp. And they tested in the control group and indeed in the kids that went to summer camp with no digital devices, their interpersonal skills. And guess what? Even within 5 days, they'd changed.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
So listen, Mind Change is available outside for Susan to sign and for you to buy. And we have to wrap up now. I want to thank you for all your questions, and apologies to those who didn't get their question in. It has been an honour, no less, to
thank you for your
chair Baroness Susan Greenfield. So a round of applause for her.
Thank you. We didn't get onto philosophy.
Well, we didn't.